Hello and welcome to Spurbs Herbs episode 108. We're going to be doing a very interesting herb today. It's an herb from the Australian Aboriginals, and I'm always excited when I do that. I spent quite a while in the outback and working with the Aboriginals, so this is always a fun one. If you're able to see the visual, there's a beautiful picture of a Desert Quandong, and we're going to talk all about that coming up right now. Today, we will explore another interesting herb of the world from Australia and Aboriginal medicine, Desert Quandong, or Santalum acuminatum, which is on the surface helpful for pain relief, but we're going to find out if it does other things other than just pain relief. We're going to do our usual deep dive into this herb and find out if there's any evidence or concerns about this herb. And as usual, we will be adding something a little different. We'll be discussing GLP-1 receptor agonists and how Chinese medicine may affect them. It's going to be another trek into the continent of Australia. Please keep listening. Before we get into that, I just wanted to tell you about an amazing special we're doing for our courses. If you use them for continuing education, professional development, or just for your own edification, we're offering 50 hours of courses for an unbelievable price. Normally this would cost $750. However, with the special code 50CEUS, that's 50 CEUs, this is going to be only $325, less than half off, quite a bit less than half off. Plus, you can get a free signed copy of one of my books. Just pay for shipping and handling. That is a free copy of Integrative Pharmacology, combining modern pharmacology with integrative medicine, or Playing the Game, a step-by-step approach to accepting insurance as an acupuncturist. For free. All you do is pay shipping and handling. Just go to the webpage www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's council, council.org/CEUS1 for this amazing deal. But hurry, it's going to end soon. So that webpage is www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org/CEUS1. And hopefully we'll see you there. So let's talk a little bit about GLP-1 agonists. So last weekend, as we were recording this episode, I did a course on glucagon, glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists and Chinese medicine. These GLP-1 agonists are probably the hottest medicine around right now. You may not recognize GLP-1 agonists, but most people are familiar with the brand names of some of these medications, such as Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound, Trulicity, and of course, Ozempic. Last week's course, which is available online, covered these medications and how Chinese medicine herbs and supplements can support patients taking them or even be used instead of them. Today, we will look at some of these aspects. So based on a May 2024 poll, about 1 in 8 adults have taken a glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonist, GLP-1RA or GLP-1A, with 6% saying they are currently taking them. This is especially prevalent. I'm assuming this is a U.S. study, by the way, a U.S. poll. This is especially prevalent in patients with specific conditions more commonly using these drugs, including 43% of diabetics, 25% of patients with heart disease, and 22% of overweight or obese patients. I was a little surprised by that because you hear these about being really good for losing weight, so I would have expected more overweight or obese patients. But diabetics, it is an anti-diabetic, and so that's good to hear, are the most prevalent users of GLP-1 agonists. Given these statistics, almost all Chinese medical practitioners either have patients taking these drugs or are thinking about taking them. GLP-1 receptor agonists, or GLP-1RAs, are also known as glucagon-like peptide-1 agonists. That's the full name for GLP. GLP-1 agonists, incretin mimetics, or GLP-1 analogs. Tirzepatide, or that's Mounjaro, Zepbound, or the brand names for that. Tirzepatide is the only dual agonist, which is both a GLP-1 and glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP, receptor agonists. Currently on the market, it's the only dual one on the market. Tirzepatide was found to be better at weight loss than semaglutide. Semaglutide is probably the most common of the GLP-1 receptor agonists. That's your Wegovy and your Ozempic in a head-to-head study. So it was found to be considerably better at weight loss than Ozempic was. GLP-1 receptor agonists are used to treat diabetes mellitus type 2 and are very useful currently for the treatment of obesity and possibly more issues like low libido, chronic kidney disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, and cardiovascular disease prevention. Collins and Costello, which are authors of the paper, say, this class of medications promotes an average weight loss of 2.9 kilograms. That's a little over 6 pounds for us, or 6.5 pounds actually for those of us in the U.S., compared to placebo. So an average weight loss of 2.9 kilograms compared to placebo, in addition to lowering both systolic and diastolic blood pressure and total cholesterol. That's a pretty big hit. You know, you can do all three of those things. That's really useful. Regarding cardiovascular effects, GLP-1 agonists can improve left ventricular ejection fraction, so that's how much gets ejected by the main chamber of the heart. Myocardial contractility, so that's how hard the heart actually contracts. Coronary blood flow, how much blood is actually flowing to the heart, that's huge. That's where heart attacks can come from. Cardiac output, that's the total output of blood from the heart. And endothelial function, which is the inner lining of the arteries, while reducing infarction size. Infarction is the technical name for a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. Technically, infarction just means a loss of oxygen, but in this case, we're talking about myocardial infarction. So it improves endothelial function while reducing infarction size and overall risks for a cardiovascular event. So that's pretty darn huge, because the population, both diabetes and obese, are going to be at high risk for cardiovascular events. Other functions of GLP-1 include agonists include increased glucose uptake in the muscles, decreased glucose production in the liver. That's good, because remember, diabetes is too much glucose. Neuroprotection, which means it helps the nerves, and increased satiety due to direct actions on the hypothalamus. So satiety means fullness. It increases the sense of fullness, so you don't eat as much. And this is because of its actions in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. GLP-1 analogs have also exhibited lower all-cause mortality, in other words, death from any cause, and a hemoglobin A1C reduction of about 1% compared to control groups in patients with type 2 diabetes. So this hemoglobin A1C is the primary marker for long-term sugar control in the body, and it can go back, it pretty much kind of looks at about the last 4 to 6 months of sugar control, and it gets to be a bit high. You know, in type 2 diabetes, we want it to be under 6.5 to 7%. So a reduction of 1% is a lot in these control groups with type 2 diabetes. So that's huge. That's showing that it does really help with long-term sugar control. Semaglutide has been shown to be helpful in metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, which is MASH. That's the MASH, metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis. What that all big word means is basically fatty liver disease. That was the old name for this. And we also talked about another one called NAFLD. I can't tell you which one is the current most common names, but they're pretty similar in the end results, in that the liver is being converted into fat, which is not good. So how do GLP-1 receptor agonists work? In other words, what we say technically is what are the mechanisms of actions of these drugs. So glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, and glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP, are typically secreted in response to a meal and causes a considerable amount of insulin secretion as a response to oral consumption of food. In diabetes mellitus 2, this response becomes absent or at least blunted. GLP-1 receptor agonists increase glucose-dependent insulin secretion, and satiety, that's that fullness, feeling of fullness, decreases postprandial glucagon secretion. So postprandial means after a meal, and glucagon is a hormone. So insulin is a hormone that takes sugar out of the blood and stores it, and glucagon is a hormone that takes the storage and puts it back in the blood. So we don't want glucagon if we're trying to control our sugar levels in the blood. And it reduces apoptosis and promotes proliferation of beta cells. So beta cells are what produce insulin. And so if there's more beta cells, there's more insulin. That's good. That means that's sugar coming out of the blood. And it reduces apoptosis. Apoptosis is a nice fancy name for programmed cell death. So these beta cells only are designed to last for a certain amount of time. And what these GLP-1 receptor agonists can do is actually increase their lifespan, is basically what we're saying when we say it reduces apoptosis, which means more of them are going to hang out for longer and put out more insulin. Again, very good for reducing sugar levels in the blood. They have been modified to have much longer half-lives than endogenous GLP-1, which is normal. When we have an endogenous compound, usually the drugs will last a lot longer because we want them to last a lot longer. GLP-1 doesn't last very long in the body, so we do want these to be around for a lot longer. And they have quite a long, several days at least, of a half-life in general, which is how we measure how long they stick around. While there may be some direct benefits, many cardiovascular risk factors are mediated by weight loss and sugar control. So even if they don't do anything specifically and directly for cardiovascular risk factors, which we think it does, just losing weight and having sugar control is going to be very beneficial for cardiovascular risk. So it's good. However, there's, as everything, every drug, there are adverse reactions. We call them adverse drug reactions, or ADRs. Commonly, they're called side effects, but we don't say that in pharmacology. So the ADRs, the adverse drug reactions, include GLP-1 receptor antagonists most frequently cause GI disturbances, including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, dizziness, mild tachycardia, so that's a rapid heart rate, infections, headaches, and dyspepsia, or just gastrointestinal discomfort, may also occur along with injection site erythema and pruritus. That means redness and itching. So these are all injected at this point. There are some pills that are being developed, and so one just had a fairly positive test, research project done on it, and so they're hoping, the manufacturers are hoping that this will come out, the pills will be coming out, the oral versions of these will be coming out soon. You might be able to find some oral versions out on the market, but these are not approved. These are from compounding pharmacies, and their efficacy has not been shown. So really all the effective GLP-1 receptor agonists are injections. There is a correlation between using GLP-1 RAs and gallbladder disorders, so we don't know exactly what that is, but it can cause gallbladder issues. Patients with severe renal dysfunction should not take GLP-1 RAs. There have been effects on the thyroid from long-term use of GLP-1 RAs in rodent models, so in rats and mice. And while human effects are still being studied, they should not be used in patients with a history or family history of multiple endocrine neoplasia 2A or 2B or medullary thyroid cancer. So it seems like if you have a thyroid issue, like you're hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, probably not a big issue. Of course, if you're hyperthyroid, you probably won't need these. But if you have cancer or neoplasia, which is a nice fancy name for cancer, then you should probably be cautious with using these drugs. A study of emergency room visits attributed to the use of semaglutide, so it was just semaglutide, showed the most common issues were gastrointestinal effects, with 69.3% of people seeking emergency room visits having gastrointestinal effects. Hypoglycemia, so too little blood sugar, and that was 16.5%, and allergic reactions, 5.5%. So those are some of our sort of numbers around adverse drug reactions. I also like to separate some of the more serious adverse drug reactions and call them red flags, and there's a couple red flags to be worried about here. GLP-1 receptor antagonists may cause acute pancreatitis and worsen diabetes-related retinopathy. So acute pancreatitis is a surgical emergency, and it can cause severe damage and death eventually. So anytime there's a lot of pain in the intestines, and what we really look for is known as a rigid abdomen or board-like abdomen, and rebound tenderness. And those are signs of acute pancreatitis. Well, technically they're signs of irritation of the tissues around there, and then that can be indicative of pancreatitis. But anything that causes that irritation is life-threatening. So if you have board-like abdomen or a rebound tenderness. And rebound tenderness means it hurts more when you release than when you push in the belly, basically. And diabetes-related retinopathy means eye issues, the retina. So this is retinal disease due to diabetes, and that is not a good thing. So it can worsen that as well. And lately, just as a relatively new one, GLP-1 agonists may also cause non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, or NAION. I call it NION. I don't know if that's appropriate or not. And that is a rapid and possibly permanent loss of vision. So that is a big negative. It's very rare, but it does happen. The other big group of drugs that I associated with NION are some of the erectile dysfunction drugs can cause that as well. Other issues. Stopping GLP-1 RAs causes weight loss and blood glucose benefits to be lost, though patients who continue to exercise maintained their weight loss. So you can maintain the weight loss, but only through hard work and exercise. So what are some potential interactions? That's a big issue. So baiguoye or ginkgo leaf, which is a Chinese herb, and a standard, a Western herb as well. A small study showed potential interference with insulin metabolism in normal individuals. Theoretically may alter blood glucose levels and affect insulin use. Potentially, this is level C evidence, with A, B, C, D being the lowest level of evidence. So there's a little bit here. Kugua or bitter melon, which is a very commonly recommended herb or even vegetable, because it's a vegetable for patients with diabetes. It's supposed to be very good for sugar control. And this bitter melon lowers plasma glucose levels and may potentiate anti-diabetic medications causing hypoglycemia. Technically at this point, I don't think GLP-1 receptor agonists really are thought to cause hypoglycemia, though they certainly might exacerbate some tendencies towards that. There does not appear to be any other clinically significant cytochrome P450 or P-glycoprotein interactions or high protein binding with any of these pharmaceuticals. In other words, as far as risks of drug-drug interactions, they don't have a lot of risks for that at this point that we know of. So what are anti-diabetic drugs according to Chinese medicine? Chinese medicine, diabetes mellitus is typically treated by some combination of qi and yin supplements, heat clearers, dampness eliminators, and blood quickeners. Of the various classes of Chinese medicinals which are used to treat diabetes, what can cause the typical symptoms of diabetes? The answer, we think, are heat-clearing, dampness-eliminating medicinals, or Qingre, Chu, Shi, Yao. Heat-clearing medicinals can damage qi and eventually yang, while dampness-eliminating medicinals can damage yin blood. Now that we have this as background, there are two aspects of GLP-1 RAs to look at: treatment of diabetes type 2 and weight loss. Either of these could be entire lectures of their own, and I do actually have them on my to-do list. When it comes to Chinese medicine, we always start with a pattern and develop appropriate treatments from there. In my full course on this topic of GLP-1 receptor agonists, I do look at these patterns and possible treatments, but that's too much for a 1-hour podcast. In fact, the whole course was 2 hours, so right there, too much. There are a lot of herbs and supplements that are said to be helpful when using GLP-1 agonists, whether to help their actions or reduce potential adverse reactions. Berberine is one of the most mentioned supplements in regard to these medications. Berberine is a constituent of golden seal root, barberry, and Oregon grape, and is being heavily promoted as nature's Ozempic. Uses: it is used as an antibiotic. This berberine is used as an antibiotic, metabolic diseases such as diabetes, prediabetes, and metabolic syndrome, and dyslipidemia. It may also be used to treat ventricular tachyarrhythmia, so that's rapid heartbeat stemming from the ventricles, congestive heart failure, colorectal adenomas, that's colorectal cancer basically, and radiation-induced intestinal injury. The science. There is some evidence berberine can help various metabolic diseases. A meta-analysis concluded berberine appeared to be efficacious for treating hyperglycemia and dyslipidemia in type 2 diabetes mellitus. However, the evidence of berberine for treating type 2 diabetes mellitus should be carefully interpreted due to low methodological quality, small sample size, limited number of trials, and unidentified risks of bias. Some small studies have shown berberine may help weight loss, lower blood sugar, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. There is some preliminary research showing possible benefit in ventricular tachyarrhythmia, radiation-induced intestinal injury, and congestive heart failure, but just preliminary. So here's the bottom line on the science here is it's not very strong, but at least there is some showing some of these things. So I think we need more evidence, but it's not horrible. Other considerations with regard to berberine: given the extreme popularity of berberine as nature's Ozempic, poor quality and contamination with microbes and heavy metals are readily available from Amazon and other less regulated sources. Be sure to know quality brands and do not trust labels from lesser known brands. Dosage: a common dose is 500 milligrams 2 to 3 times per day. And side effects and red flags of berberine: berberine may cause gastrointestinal effects such as diarrhea or constipation, nausea, gas, and abdominal pain, as well as a skin rash. It may increase bilirubin and cause jaundice. For this reason, it should not be used by pregnant or lactating women. It may lower blood sugar levels and blood pressure, and caution should be used when taking other medications with the same effects. So Ralph is asking, is berberine identical with the North American golden seal root? No, it is not identical. Berberine is a constituent of that. It is not, so it's just one of the chemicals involved with golden seal. So it would not be the same thing at all. This is more of a concentrated form of it. Interactions with berberine: it appears berberine may inhibit cytochrome P450, 2D6, 2C9, and the one we're particularly worried about, 3A4 in humans. That is a prime target for drug-drug interaction research. So the fact that it does affect 3A4 means it is at higher risk for a drug-drug interaction. It appears, at least in animals, berberine is an inhibitor of P-glycoprotein, which is another risk factor for drug-drug interactions. So there's definitely some potential for drug-drug interactions with berberine. In Chinese medicine, berberine appears to treat damp heat. That's according to Dharmananda, who is a prolific thought leader in our field. Combining Chinese medicine and GLP-1 RAs. Any of these patterns, whether for diabetes, obesity, and herbs and supplements, can be the basis of supporting patients who are taking GLP-1 RAs or other diabetes medications. The biggest concern is drug-herb interactions. When I combine herbs with a drug regimen, I always follow start low, go slow. I also have a list of steps which I talk about in various of my courses, including this one on GLP-1 receptors, but I like the start low, go slow. I created that. So start at a low dose, and slowly increase it to therapeutic levels. This allows observation for interactions before they become serious. What is low depends on the patient. A patient who is generally healthy and is taking a drug or two, depending on the drugs, could be started at half to 3/4 of our desired dose. But an older patient on multiple drugs may be started at 1/4 to 1/3 of the desired dose. Ramping up to full dosage can take 1 to 3 weeks, depending on multiple factors such as age, conditions, constitution, chronicity, etc. In addition, we recommend not trying to do too much at any one time. By this we mean don't start a new herbal or supplement regimen at the same time a new drug is being started while initiating a new acupuncture treatment. Separate them, so it is possible to know if the symptoms a patient is experiencing can be attributed to side effects of the new drug, interactions between the drug and the herbs, side effects of the new herbs, or the acupuncture itself. If everything is thrown together, it becomes impossible to determine what is helping or not. Now, when I was a student, we used to do this all the time. We used to do an acupuncture treatment and send our patients home with herbs. I don't do that in practice anymore. I will do an acupuncture treatment on the first, and then I'll have them come back and see how they reacted to the acupuncture, and then potentially add in herbs to the regimen. And the reason for that is I want to see how the patient responds to the acupuncture alone. And then once I kind of get a baseline, and maybe it's more than just 1 or 2 visits, once I get a baseline of how they react to acupuncture, then I can add something else in to help. Now, that's a general rule. Sometimes I break it, but that's a general rule. So bottom line, glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists, or GLP-1 RAs, are incredibly popular, and a large number of patients are taking them primarily for weight loss. There are natural supplement alternatives to these drugs. Chinese medicine can probably enhance the effectiveness of these agents and prevent or lessen any impact of adverse effects. There isn't research to that effect, but I do believe that is a good supposition. However, while there are minimal risk factors for drug-drug interactions with GLP-1 RAs, there is always a risk, and appropriate precautions should be undertaken. And with that introduction to GLP-1 agonists complete, let's talk about today's herb. That was a lot of preliminary stuff. Let's get into today's herb. And we're going to start with a traditional story. The following is a traditional story from the Mamili people of Central Australia. I can't do these pronunciations, so please, I'm going to do my best. The Central Australian Yankunytjatjara region, as translated in the book Puno Yankunytjatjara, Plant Use Traditional Methods of Preparing Foods, Medicines, Utensils, and Weapons from Native Plants. So these are just some stories that were told by Aborigines about this particular herb that we're going to talk about. And the herb we're talking about, of course, is quandongs. Someone would say, let's go for quandongs. Women, come on, let's go get some quandong. The women would all be singing out like this to each other. They wouldn't call the men. Then they'd go find a tree. Oh, there's one laden with fruit. It's borne down with fruit. They'd gather plenty of it, and they'd also gather some of the dried fallen fruit. The dried out stuff is really nice and sweet. After tasting it, they'd gather it till it filled their bowls and take it away with them. After bringing it back to camp, they'd bake some of it. Just bake it a little. Then get it out and clean it in water. Wash it, and when it's clean, break the flesh off like this and put them to one side. Break them off and put them to one side. The edible flesh of the plant, they break off the flesh, peel it off, and put it to one side. I'll just make this up into balls. She'd make it into little balls and give it out. But she puts some to one side and says, I'm going to soak this directly. I am? Yes, I'm going to soak it. And she'd soak it in plenty of water. Squish it around for a long time, really thoroughly, and then put it to one side. The kids would clean off the stones. Yes, by sort of sucking off the remaining flesh. They might try to eat some of the food that's been soaked. You'll eat it all up, you kids. Just clean the stones. Only the stones. Don't eat what's been put aside. The mother would shoo the children away as they ate. And so the kids cleaned the stones and left the rest alone. They wouldn't touch what was left for their father. And the father would come back and see what the women had done. My wife here has soaked and made up some quandong. And then he'd eat. After eating and eating, he'd leave off having got full. Oh, yes. There'd still be plenty of the silk stuff left. There'd be lots left. So all the other sons and grandsons would have some too. It's an abundant food. What'll I do with this ball of Quandong? Yes, give it to me. He'd take it back with him to eat at camp. Then he'd have a sleep, rest a while, and when he felt hungry, he'd eat. Yes, from that same ball of Quandong. It's really good when you don't have meat. Continuing with another story, or at least another translation. The edible part on the outside we'd gather and eat. And as for the stones, we'd collect them too, hit them with a rock, prise them open, and get the kernels. You know, the inside part. We'd gather up a whole lot of them. My grandmother would gather them up and grind them. She'd grind them in a wira dish after chopping them up well. It's to rub into aches and pains, you know, the kernel inside. The skin on the outside they'd eat as food, and they would rub the kernels into the back. If you had a backache, you'd rub it in. Sleep the night, then get up and thinks, hey, that pain of mine is gone. The dear thing. With the aid of that medicine, I've recovered. They just get better and go off for game. Yes, that's all I'm saying. So these are quotes from a book that were translated into English. So traditional story. So let's get into what this is. So what we're talking about is known as Quandong, Desert Quandong. The name for this, the family is Santalum, and the species is Santalum acuminatum, with R period, BR period in parentheses with a DC. And remember, these are indicative of the biologists who actually classified them. So there was original classification that was reclassified by DC. You can look up these abbreviations. So the medicinal part, the fruit is tasty and eaten raw or dried and reconstituted. The kernels are processed and used as a topical application, and other parts of the plant also have medicinal properties. We're going to talk about the leaves a little bit as well. Other names are sweet Quandong, native peach, wild peach, and I have native peach again, so I'm going to correct that. The Wiradjuri people of New South Wales use the name Quandong, from which the name Quandong was adapted. Other indigenous names include Wolgol from Noongar or southwestern Australia, Guchu, again, I don't know how to pronounce these, so I'm doing my best. Guchu, that's Gutchu, from Jobaluk, western Victoria. Wanjanu or Mangata from the Pitjantjatjara or Uluru area, so that's central. And Guarti or Guarti from the Nurunga. So lots of different names and lots of different traditional names for this as well. Let's talk about the Santalum family. So that's the family that this belongs in. According to Stagistic and Cadella, Santalum is often referred to as the sandalwood family. So this is in the family of sandalwoods. There are about 44 genera and 990 species in this family. Usually they are herbs or shrubs, though they may be trees and are root or stem hemiparasites. So hemiparasites, semi-parasites, half parasites, and this what we're talking about today is also a hemiparasite. The leaves are opposite or alternate, simple, entire, and often soft, and the flowers are varied. The fruits are a nutlet, drupe, berries, or pseudo-drupe. And useful species include Indian, African, and Australian sandalwood, mistletoe, and several are used in tanning, and many have edible fruits. Several species are used in Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine. Not this one. This is strictly Aboriginal medicine, not in Chinese medicine at all, so we're going to find out. So let's talk about a description of this Santalum acuminatum. According to the Knoll Arbor Travel Guide, which had a nice little page on Quandong, the Quandong is a truly unique native Australian fruit. Found in the arid and semi-arid regions of all Australian mainland states, Quandong trees have been classified as belonging to the Santalum genus of plants. Ideally adapted to arid environments, the Santalum acuminatum species is known to be a semi-parasitic plant. Quandong trees can tolerate high soil salinity levels and often rely for their complete water requirements from the root systems of host plants. Across their native distribution range, Quandong trees typically grow 2 to 3 meters in height, with a dense leathery crown of leaves perhaps 2 meters wide. What is the history of this herb? Species was first described by Robert Brown, so that's that RBR that we talked about originally with the species name. Species was first described by Robert Brown, named in Prodromos Florae Novae Hollandiae, written in 1810 as Fusanus acuminatus, based on its type collection made at Fowler's Bay, South Australia in 1802. Brown gave the Latin epithet acuminatus to denote the leaves, sharpened or pointed. The botanist Alphonse Pirmi de Candolle, which is that DC, gave the current name in 1857, placing it in the genus Santalum, the genus containing Australian sandalwood, Santalum spicatum, and white sandalwood, Santalum album. Several botanical names have been deemed to be synonymous with Santalum acuminatum, as described in Flora of Australia in 1984, and the Australian Plant Census in 2006. These include Santalum Priscilla F. Mule in Fragmenta Phytographiae Australiae in 1861, Santalum cognatum and Santalum prasanum of Michel from 1845, and Santalum densiflorum Gand in 1919. Traditionally, the Quandong was an important food source for Australian Aborigines. Amongst male members of Central Australia's Pitjantjatjara people, Quandongs were considered a suitable substitute for meat, especially when hunting game was in short supply. Around the Everard Ranges, Quandong gathering and food preparation was considered Pitjantjatjara women's business. Ripe red Quandong fruits would be eaten raw or dried for later use. Typically, Everard Ranges women would collect Quandongs in bark dishes, separate the edible fruit from the pitted stone, and then roll the edible fruit into a ball. The Quandong ball was then broken up for consumption by the tribal group. Traditional uses. Amongst Australian Aborigines, Quandongs were much valued for their medicinal properties. Specialized uses of the Quandong include a form of tea which was drunk as a purgative. That was the leaves, really. Quandong tree roots were also ground down and used as an infusion for the treatment of rheumatism. Typically, Quandong leaves were crushed and mixed with saliva to produce a topical ointment for skin sores and boils. Encased within each Quandong seed is an oil-rich kernel, which was also processed in a similar fashion to treat skin disorders. Quandong kernels could also be eaten, and some tribal groups were known to employ crushed kernels as a form of hair conditioning oil. Ingeniously, Australia's Aborigines appeared to be aware that Quandongs were a preferred food source of emus, and that a ready supply of Quandong seeds could be found in their droppings. So that's interesting. Some of these traditional uses are supported by other sources. Traditional Aboriginal medicines in the Northern Territory of Australia from 1993 says liniment was produced from the kernels to topically relieve pain of swelling, bruises, sprains, and back pain. Another book, Bushfires and Bush Tucker, or Aboriginal Plant Use in Central Australia, discusses this use as well as other non-medicinal uses of the plant. And Australian Medicinal Plants also discusses this use as well as using pounded leaves applied to treat boils, sores, and gonorrhea. Bushfires and Bush Tucker, Aboriginal Plant Use in Central Australia, also discuss other traditional non-medicinal uses of Quandong. The wood, especially that from the roots, is used to make bowls and other objects. Nowadays, it's commonly used to make animal carvings and artifacts for sale. Water is often trapped in the hollows in the trunk and is extracted by sucking it out with a type of straw made from the bark. Children use the seeds for marbles. This plant features in Aboriginal mythology, and important increased ceremonies for the fruit are carried out. So in other words, there are rituals around this. Punu Yakunichijera, plant use traditional methods of preparing foods, medicines, utensils, and weapons from native plants, says the wood is used to carve snakes, lizards, and similar items for sale. The leaves are used for smoothing these down. So in other words, there's economic and medicinal uses for this. And there's more, other uses. That Null Arbor travel guide discusses several other uses of quandongs. Australia's early pastoralists also discovered their own unique uses for the quandong. Away from the homesteads for weeks at a time, stockmen would often bake dampers infused with quandong leaves. The result was apparently a refreshing change from the usual damper. When in season, between October and February, many farmers would also take their families out for a quandong picnic. After gathering quandongs, the peeled fruit was used to make a variety of jams, chutneys, and quandong pies. Quandong trees possess an aromatic wood that was traditionally used by Aboriginal people in smoking ceremonies. So let's talk about dosage and preparation of this. The internet search did not fill any information on dosing for medicinal purposes. As a topical, its use as needed is probably fine. As a fruit, it appears relatively large quantities can be ingested without much regard, so that's good. The biggest issue with dosing may be the use as a purgative tea. You certainly don't want to overdo purgatives. So, but again, no discussion was had on how much in any of my sources. Quality. The Australian Native Plants Society says the small white flowers occur in clusters and are followed by 25 millimeter, about an inch diameter, fleshy fruits, which turn bright red when ripe. The seed within the fruit is protected by a hard woody shell. The seeds are spherical and around 10 millimeters in diameter. There were no descriptions found of high quality specimens, so that's just a general description. What about his Chinese medical action? So I was unable to find anything specifically discussing quandong in terms of Chinese medicine, so we need to speculate. The Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation is a semi-governmental corporation tasked with research and development for a more profitable, sustainable, and dynamic rural sector. A paper by this organization, focused on Quandong Santalum acuminatum, describes the taste of quandong as aroma of dry lentils, some earthy and fermented notes. Taste is slightly sour and salty. Fruit is usually dry textured, tart tasting, and sweetness can vary greatly between trees. This description implies the taste of quandong from a Chinese medical point of view as sour, salty, and sweet. Given its effects to help aching muscles, it may affect the liver, and its effects as a potential purgative indicates it may affect the spleen. And its effects helping boils, sores, gonorrhea indicate it may be cooling and possibly phlegm clearing. Described so far are the effects of different parts of the plant, and so our conclusion of Chinese medical effects should be broken down into these individual parts rather than as an overall approach. So I'm kind of implying that throughout this process, that I'm kind of mashing everything together, but it should probably be a little bit more separated. So with this caveat, given their uses, it appears quandong is sour, salty, and sweet, cooling, and enters the liver and spleen, and is qi and blood invigorating, purging, and possibly phlegm resolving. So that would be my take on the Chinese medical actions of this herb. Comparisons and combinations. There are no obvious comparisons or combinations discovered during my research. Sandalwood, which can consist of other species in the same family of quandong, is often discussed as a comparison point, more in the growing and commercial uses rather than medicinal uses. And while there may be some similarities between sandalwood and quandong, quandong lacks the more fragrant volatile compounds of sandalwood, and therefore it appears not to have similar medicinal uses. Contents. Focus on Quandong Santalum acuminatum discusses the contents of Santalum acuminatum include phenolic-based antioxidants and also contains vitamin E, folate or folic acid, and zinc, magnesium, calcium, and iron at levels higher than the blueberry. So in other words, quite high levels for these. The Null Arbor Travel Guide says Quandongs have a vitamin C content higher than oranges and almost certainly saved many early Australian explorers from scurvy. The science. A search yielded no scholarly reviews of Santalum acuminatum. A web page by Auctor, A-U-C-T-O-R, describes some of its constituents in terms of their potential pharmacological effects. Quandongs contain almost twice the amount of vitamin C as an orange does. They also provide iron, zinc, magnesium, vitamin E, folate, and calcium. The fruit is rich in phenolic-based antioxidants that are known to protect against medical conditions like Alzheimer's, cancer, and cardiovascular diseases. The rutin in the fruit not only reduces the proliferation of free radicals, but it also works with vitamin C to minimize dark circles under the eyes, as well as reduce the effects of aging on the skin. Quandong kernels contain oils that have anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties. So this was as close as I could get to some of the science behind this. I think the contents of these have been well established. There's been research on what is in these, but not necessarily any clinical research on what they do from a pharmaceutical point of view. So I feel like all of these are, here's the contents. We know these contents do this, so it probably helps with these things. So I would take all of this with a bit of a grain of salt if I were you. There was one in vitro study, which means in glass, so not clinical study, that showed Quandong extract exhibited superior cytoprotective activities, in other words, cell protection, and reduced the hydrogen peroxide-induced death of hepatocellular carcinoma. So hepatocellular means liver cancer. Hepatocellular carcinoma is liver cancer cells. So it reduced the hydrogen peroxide-induced death of hepatocellular carcinoma cells between 25 and 50%. So that's interesting, but again, it's not clinical. It doesn't mean that if you eat this, this is what's going to happen. It means that when they combine these hepatocellular carcinoma cells with an extract of Quandong, this is what experienced, and that does not mean the same thing would happen in the human body. So take that with a big grain of salt. What I get from the science of Quandong at this point is there's some very interesting constituents. I would love to see more research done on the medicinal properties of this. But at this point, I don't think there's a lot of research supporting its use as a medicinal item. But hopefully that will change. Drug-herb interactions. A literature search did not find any general drug-herb interactions involving Quandong, including specifically cytochrome P450 and P-glycoprotein. One older paper from 1994 showed a general increase of cytochrome P450 in rats fed Quandong kernel oil. This is probably not significant for several reasons, including it is a rat, not a clinical study. It does not discuss different subtypes of cytochrome P450. It is older, and the doses of the oil were much higher than humans would ingest in general. The American Herbal Products Association's Botanical Safety Handbook, which is a great large book and has many, many, many herbs in it, does not have an entry for this herb. So I like to look at that for safety information and drug-herb interactions. Concerns. As a fruit and traditional food, Quandong is going to be a relatively safe food. The concerns that arise from this plant come from other constituents than the fruit. Latz discusses one concern. The relatively large kernels are also highly nutritious, having a 25% protein and 70% oil content. It does appear, however, that this food source is rarely utilized. There is possibly some evidence that in hard times, discarded stones found among an old camp have been gathered and cracked open for seeds, which are then eaten. However, other evidence suggests that the seeds are not eaten, but used only for medicinal purposes. It seems that there is a toxic principle in the seeds, which is removed by roasting. However, the toxin may decay with time, and Aboriginal people, aware of this, possibly only eat the seeds after a certain time has elapsed. that is interesting. That really becomes the only real concern I've seen about this. Now, I haven't talked a lot about what's happening with this. They've tried to cultivate Quandong and they've had mixed success with it. It would be a really interesting potential economic food source, and as well as some of these other potentially medicinal sources. But it's difficult as a semi-parasite. It is hard to grow properly, and so they've had mixed results with this, even though it's pretty prolific in nature in Australia. But it's also kind of protected. You're not really supposed to go out and start picking it unless certain conditions, and I don't know what those are. And I'm sure they may be national, but they may be state by state in Australia. I don't know. So it's an interesting. There's been several attempts to make this more of an economic crop, basically, and those haven't succeeded at this point, and those were happening 10, 15 years ago. So if they were to succeed, I would expect them to succeed at this point. So I don't know exactly where we are with all that, but that is something that kind of comes up sporadically in the literature. Summary. We started our discussion today by discussing glucagon-like peptide-1 agonists, or GLP-1 agonists, in Chinese medicine. From there, we trekked into the lesser-known herb and medicinal properties of Desert Quandong, or Santalum acuminatum. While sounding very tasty, it also appears to have some useful medicinal properties in helping pain and inflammation, skin conditions, and constipation. However, the science is far from conclusive. Overall, another interesting herb that needs a lot more research. In our next episode, we will be exploring another interesting Chinese herb, fan shei ye, or senna folium, or just senna leaf. This herb is in the Chinese medical subcategory of purgatives under the category of downward draining herbs. It can be very helpful for constipation. And as usual, we will be exploring something a little different. Please join us for this fascinating episode. See you in 2 weeks. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. If you like this podcast, please do us a humongous favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app, or just subscribe. We'd love either of those to happen, and we thank you for even considering doing either of those. And don't forget our amazing continuing education deal at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org/CEUS1. CEUS1. That's www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org/CEUS1. CEUS1. And you can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com or at our website www.spurbsherbs.com. And as usual, we have quite the bibliography. Thank you very much.